So you've decided you want to become a medieval doctor. A noble pursuit, certainly, helping the sick, aiding the wounded, and perhaps even gaining the respect of your local lord if you survive long enough. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before you go donning a long robe, acquiring a bag of dried herbs, or crafting your own surgical saw out of iron and wishful thinking, you need to understand just how deeply unpleasant, confusing, and sticky this profession really was. This is not a job for the faint-hearted or the clean-fingered. It's a career filled with contradictions, superstition, and the constant lingering scent of body odor, blood, and mystery pus dot you wake up in your modest chamber, probably somewhere above a marketplace or near a monastery. The scent of boiling, tallow, sewage, and yesterday's turnips is already wafting through the wooden slats in your shutters. Before you've even had breakfast, if such a luxury exists today, you might be visited by someone from town. They're desperate. Their brother has a bloated neck. Their child can't stop coughing. Their neighbor passed out while tilling the field and now won't wake up. All eyes turn to you. You're a man of knowledge, after all. But that knowledge, let's be honest, is a tangled braid of Greek philosophy, religious guesswork, and trial by failure. You were taught that the body is governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if someone is unwell, it's probably because one of these invisible fluids is having a bit of a tantrum. Good luck figuring out which one. You don't have a stethoscope. You don't have a thermometer. What you do have is a belief system from the 2nd century, maybe a vial of someone's pee, and possibly a few leeches you keep in a damp jar. These are your tools. You were educated or at least partially trained by men who revered Galen and Hippocrates, thinkers from 1,000 years ago who wrote their scrolls long before anyone discovered germs. Circulation, or why humans really get sick. You might know how to read, which is a huge advantage, but what you're reading isn't always helpful. Treat fever with bloodletting, one manual says. Apply a poultice of boiled onions and sheep's dung, says another. Avoid bathing too frequently lest your skin absorb dangerous vapors. That last one might be why your patients, and you smell, the way they do. Becoming a doctor wasn't like today's rigorous medical licensing process. There were schools, yes, particularly in places like Salerno or Montpellier, if you were lucky enough to study there, but for many, training consisted of being an apprentice to someone only slightly more competent than you. Perhaps you followed an older physician on his rounds. Perhaps you assisted with surgery, by which we mean you helped hold someone down while they were being cut open on a kitchen table. Your mentor might be more philosopher than practitioner. He might spend more time consulting his astrological charts than examining actual patients. Still, you listened. You took notes. You memorized herbs. And before long, you were expected to strike out on your own. Now that you're officially a doctor, the expectations are overwhelming. You might be the only healer in your village or one of many in a city crowded with sick people, beggars, and animals that are as diseased as the humans. There's no such thing as emergency care. People will simply drag their loved one to your door and expect a miracle. Broken legs, infected, boils, unexplained fevers, pregnancy complications, coughing up blood, you're supposed to treat all of it. Most days, you just hope the patient gets better in spite of your treatment. If they die, and they often do, you say their humors were too imbalanced to save. You offer prayers. You give a serious nod. You move on to church. Of course, looms over everything. You are not allowed to dissect a body. That would be desecration. You must always consider spiritual causes before earthly ones. Perhaps this woman is ill because she angered God. Perhaps the man's stomach pain is due to demonic imbalance. When in doubt, offer confession. Recommend penance. Mix a draught of vinegar, rosemary, and hope. If the soul is healed, maybe the body will follow. There's very little glamour in this life. You wear a robe that's probably stained with things you stopped trying to identify weeks ago. Your shoes squelch through muddy streets filled with refuse. You are often tired, hungry, cold. The winter winds creep through the cracks in your Home, the summer heat rots your remedies. Patients sometimes pay you in chickens or bread. Others can't pay at all. You take what you can. If you're lucky, a nobleman will summon you and offer silver in exchange for treating his gout or hemorrhoids. You will have to pretend you know what you're doing. You always do that, and then there's the judgment. Not just from the church, but from your own community. When you fail to save a child, something that happens often, they may blame you, accuse you. Perhaps you didn't pray hard enough. Perhaps your treatment caused more harm than good. Rumors spread easily. You become the doctor who killed old John with his bleeding jars. People whisper. You keep your head down. You carry on, it's a lonely profession. You cannot share your failures with colleagues. There are no hospitals to refer patients. 2. No reliable texts to consult beyond the contradictory scrolls passed down from ancient times. You try new remedies, boiled snails, dried wolf liver, rose water mixed with powdered emerald, but you never know if they'll help or harm. Medicine is art, but it's also guesswork, and in this era, it's mostly the latter. You tell yourself, you're doing good, that the people need you. That healing is a calling, and maybe it is. But most days, it feels like trying to fix a crumbling wall with damp straw. You treat one person. Another falls sick. You stop a fever. Another man dies of an infected cut. You live surrounded by illness, decay, and desperation. You've grown used to it. You don't flinch at the sight of oozing sores or half-rotted limbs. You just wash your hands if there's water and move on to the next house, the next suffering. Face the next hopeless case. Still want to be a medieval doctor? In the modern world, we tend to assume that doctors come equipped with years of rigorous training, practical exams, and knowledge based on decades of evidence and experimentation. But rewind the clock to the medieval period, and becoming a doctor was not so much a standardized profession as it was a blend of guesswork, memorization, and a whole lot of inherited misinformation. If you wanted to become a doctor in medieval Europe, your educational path was less about discovering how the body worked and more about learning what ancient philosophers thought the body might be doing, despite the fact that those philosophers had never dissected a human being, let alone understood what germs were not. So, where did you start? If you were extremely fortunate, and by that we mean rich male, and born into a family with connections, you might study at one of the few medical schools that existed at the time. Places like the University of Salerno in southern Italy, or the famous University of Montpellier in France, offered the closest thing to a formal medical education available in Europe during the Middle Ages. These institutions were rare, prestigious, and rigid. Your studies would begin not with touching patients, but with reading, lots of reading. And not just any books, these were very old books, many of them already centuries out of date when you crack them open. But no one questioned. Then, why would they? They were written by Galen and Hippocrates, revered ancient Greek and Roman physicians who were considered the unchallengeable authorities on all things medical. Your medical education began with the study of the liberal arts, especially logic, and philosophy, because medieval medicine was considered more of an intellectual discipline than a practical one. You were not training to be a hands-on healer so much as a man of learned thought who interpreted symptoms through a philosophical lens. You memorized Aristotle's views on the human body. You absorbed Galen's theories on anatomy and humors. And you listened closely to Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose canon of medicine was one of the most influential texts of the entire Middle Ages. Despite the fact that it too relied on outdated ideas about the body, this was a system built, not on challenge and discovery, but on reverence and repetition. No one was performing dissections in any regular or systematic way. In fact, the practice was often discouraged or outright forbidden. The church frowned upon opening human bodies. So much of what passed for anatomy in these texts came from animal dissection or no dissection at all. Galen, for instance, had based much of his anatomical writing on monkeys and pigs. That meant doctors were learning about human kidneys, livers, and hearts based on animal organs. and then applying those lessons to real human patients. This would be a bit like setting the wiring of a toaster to fix a broken computer. It might feel similar at a glance, but in practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Your education also included the concept of the four humors, which was more than just a theory, it was the absolute framework through which all illness was understood. You were taught that every person contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was defined as the balance of these humors and disease as their imbalance. A fever, too much yellow bile, depression, that's black bile overwhelming your system, coughing up mucus, clearly an excessive phlegm. Almost every condition could be squeezed into this paradigm, and almost every treatment revolved around trying to restore that balance, whether by bleeding, purging, sweating, or prescribing strange concoctions designed to nudge the body back toward harmony. Never mind that none of it was based on actual biology. It was what the book said. And so it was followed. Outside the university, things were even murkier. Many so-called doctors didn't have access to formal training at all. Instead, they learned through apprenticeships, which might sound practical until you realize that they were often apprenticing under men who themselves had learned from guesswork. Superstition, or bad translations of bad ideas. The printing press hadn't been invented yet, so books were scarce and copied by hand, usually in Latin. That meant that your average village healer or town doctor might have never seen a medical manuscript in his life. Instead, he picked up treatments and techniques from observation, oral tradition, and maybe a tattered herbal guide passed down through generations. In these environments, medicine blended seamlessly with folklore. A poultice of moldy bread. Foxfat might be recommended for a sore. A bleeding might be performed under the light of a full moon. If someone was truly ill, maybe a priest would be called too, just in case demons were involved. Even those who had books often faced another obstacle: translation. Many original medical texts were in Greek or Arabic. These were translated into Latin, often several times over. Each version introducing errors, confusion, or additions based on the translator's own understanding or lack thereof. It was not uncommon for a mistranslation to result in a wildly incorrect instruction. A word that originally meant apply cool compress might be misunderstood as bleed until pale. This meant that even the scholars, the supposedly elite doctors of the age, were working with material that had been mangled by generations of misunderstanding. And let's not forget astrology. No medieval medical education was complete without learning how the stars and planets affected human health. You were taught to create an astrological chart for each patient, using the position of celestial bodies to determine when to perform treatments, administer herbs, or begin a bloodletting. Saturn's influence could cause melancholy. Mars might bring fever. Mercury, in retrograde, might suggest intestinal upset. This wasn't considered fringe science. It was core to your training. A patient's birthday could be just as important as their symptoms. If their humors seemed out of balance, but Venus was ascending, you might delay a treatment. After all, the stars knew best. All of this education, whether learned from the university halls of Salerno or the dusty back room of a local healer, produced a doctor who is not so much a scientist as a philosopher, mystic, and herbalist rolled into one. You weren't expected to cure every illness, but you were expected to explain it, preferably using Latin words that made your patient feel they were in capable hands. Your authority came not from success, but from sounding like you knew what Galen would have done. Your failures weren't necessarily your fault. They were often blamed on the patient's moral failings. Astrological misfortune or divine will, you were not expected to save everyone, just to try with confidence. And so with your head full of books, your pouch full of herbs, and your soul full of doubt you weren't allowed to express, you stepped out into the world as a doctor. But what you knew, truly knew, about the human body could fit into a very small jar. You had no concept of bacteria, no knowledge of how the heart pumped blood, no idea what insulin was, or that mosquitoes carried disease. But you had theories And more importantly, you had tradition. That would have to be enough. You walked from town to town or stayed planted in one village for life, delivering treatments that might help, might harm, or might do nothing at all. You gave people hope in the form of rosemary water and purgatives. You prescribed fasting, leeching, prayers, and crushed pearls. You were revered when patients improved and blamed when they didn't. And all of it, every blood-soaked rag, every scribbled note in the margins of your old text, every desperate plea from a coughing child's mother stemmed from a pile of books, written by people who'd never seen a virus, never understood anatomy, and never questioned whether a balance of humors might be the wrong way to understand a fever dot in the end. Your education was not about accuracy. It was about authority. If you quoted the right names, wore the right robes, and said the right words in Latin, people believed you. Whether or not they survived your treatments, well, that was up to the stars. Now that you've memorized a few Latin phrases. Practice looking wise while consulting the stars, and sworn fealty to the four humors. It's time to look inside your trusty medical kit. This is the bag you'll carry. To the bedside of the wounded and the dying, your arsenal of hope, horror, and medieval improvisation. You will open it solemnly, perhaps with a flourish, and inside will be the tools of your trade, not sleek instruments of polished steel and ergonomic design, but rough, hand-forged implements that have seen too many wounds and not nearly enough washing. In this bag lies the raw, splintered truth of what it meant to be a doctor in a time when germs were unknown. Anesthesia was a fantasy, and hygiene was for monks and nobles sometimes. Let us begin with your most versatile friend, the blade. The medieval doctor's knife is not sleek. It is a stubby, often rusting thing with a wooden handle carved by hand or bartered from a local blacksmith. It might double as a kitchen knife, or have done so last week. This humble blade is your tool for draining boils, slicing into abscesses, cutting away dead flesh, and, in some particularly unfortunate cases, amputating limbs. There is no standardization. One knife may be curved for lancing pustules. Another might be straight for deep cuts. There's no sterilization process, of course. You may rinse it in water or wipe it on your robe between patients. If you're particularly cautious, you might heat it in a flame. But more often than not, the blade goes from one infected wound to the next without a second thought. Infection is a mystery to you. So the pus-covered knife remains your steadfast ally. Next to your blades are your jars of leeches. They squirm gently in their cloudy water, waiting for the warmth of human skin. Leeches are one of your most prized tools. They do what you cannot, draw blood in a way that seems almost elegant compared to slicing open a vein. According to your training, most illness stems from an excess of blood, or at least some kind of imbalance among the humors, and these tiny creatures are your portable remedy. You might keep them in a small wooden box or a glass vial padded with damp cloth. They are applied to swollen limbs, flushed faces, even behind the ears, and left to gorge themselves until bloated. Some patients faint. Some cry. You remain stoic. This is science, or what passes for it. You also carry a variety of herbs and plant materials, bundled in linen, tucked into pouches, or ground into powders. Dried lavender, for calming the nerves. Rosemary, for memory and cleansing. Horehound, for cough. Pennyroyal, despite its dangers, for menstruation. Valerian, for sleep. You have roots, berries, barks, and seeds, many of which you can't quite identify with certainty anymore because the labels faded weeks ago. Sometimes you boil them into teas or mash them into poultices with pig fat or wine. Sometimes you prescribe them as infusions or chewables. There is a comforting logic to these plants. They at least feel natural, even if their effects are inconsistent. Still, you carry them like talismans, always hoping that the next mixture might be the one that works. And then there's the ever-important mortar and pestle. It's heavy, made of stone or iron, and it grinds everything from dried toads to emerald. Dust. This tool is the heart of your preparation ritual. You sit by candlelight, grinding away, inhaling the bitter scent of roots and powders, mixing ingredients that came from the apothecary. The market, or a traveling herbalist with questionable credentials, Your patients see you at work and believe they are watching a master at his craft. In truth, you are experimenting, sometimes guessing, often improvising, always hoping the result is more helpful than harmful. You have jars of ointments, thick paste made from animal fat, herbs, and sometimes crushed insects. They are smeared on wounds, rubbed into chests, and applied to everything from bruises to tumors. Many of them smell terrible. Some sting, a few have a mild effect. Most simply keep the wound from drying out, which may or may not be a good thing. In your mind, they balance heat and moisture, coolness and dryness. Everything in the world of humors is about opposites. If the illness is cold and wet, apply something hot and dry. If it is hot and angry, soothe it with something cool. The actual source of the illness, of course, remains a mystery, so you mix and match, applying your treatments with the solemnity of a priest delivering last rites. Speaking of mysterious substances, no medieval doctor's kit would be complete without a few animal-based cures. You may carry powdered bezoar taken from the stomach of a goat and believed to cure poisoning. There might be dried mice, or pieces, of viper flesh, which supposedly ward off sickness. The fat of a bear, rendered and cooled, is thought to be healing for wounds. Some doctors recommend applying a poultice made from boiled earthworms to swellings. Others use pigeon droppings or cow dung. All of these are tools in your arsenal, just as valuable, at least in theory, as any herb or blade. You believe, or pretend to believe, that these bizarre materials have power. Your patients often believe it too. Let us not forget your urine flask. This small glass bottle contains the golden fluid you use to diagnose everything from liver trouble to heartbreak. Patients bring their urine to you, or you collect it yourself and hold it up to the light like a jeweler examining a gemstone. You might sniff it, taste it, or swirl it slowly while reciting the qualities of each color. A pale straw hue might indicate weakness of the stomach. A deep reddish tint suggests too much blood. Cloudiness could mean phlegmatic imbalance. There is even a wheel of colors and illustrated diagram known as a urine wheel to help you interpret the hues. Patients watch, wide-eyed, as you frown in thought over their bottle. You give a grave nod and declare, excess heat in the liver. They nod too, though they don't know what that means. You hand them a bitter tonic and hope it makes them feel better. You also carry small charms and relics, blessed rings, bits of scripture, maybe a saint's finger bone or a scrap of cloth touched to a shrine. You may not fully believe in their power, but your patients do, and so they are part of the healing process. For the deeply religious, the line between spiritual illness and physical illness is thin. A prayer may be as important as a poultice, a relic as potent as rosemary. These sacred items lend weight to your presence. They reassure, they soothe. In your toolkit. There may even be surgical tool, hooks, forceps, clamps, bone saws. These are rough, brutal instruments, more suited to carpentry than medicine. You use them for removing arrows, cutting away gangrenous flesh, and on the rare occasion, attempting to repair a hernia or set a broken bone. There are no painkillers, only strong wine and stronger men to hold the patient down. The saw goes through flesh and bone with a sickening crunch. You do it quickly. You bandage the stump with linen and whisper a prayer. Sometimes they live. Sometimes they don't. There's also the ever-important staff or walking stick, a symbol of your station. Even if your feet are sore and your back bent from carrying that heavy bag, it makes you look the part, even when you feel like an actor. In a play with no script, when you arrive in a village, people recognize your silhouette, the robe, the staff, the bag. You are the doctor. You carry pain and hope in equal measure, and let us not forget the mask. If plague is in the air, you may wear a long-beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs and spices. It is supposed to protect you from miasmas, the invisible bad air believed to cause disease. The beak is stuffed with lavender, cloves, myrrh, even vinegar-soaked rags. The mask looks terrifying, but it provides no real protection. Still, it is better than nothing. Or so you hope. In the end, your toolkit is less a chest of scientific instruments and more a collection of desperate ideas, shaped by centuries of misunderstanding and layered with tradition. It is filled with rusted metal, rotting herbs, slippery jars, and a smell of sweat and fear. But it is what you have. It is what you carry into every house, every darkened room, every field where a soldier groans in pain. You carry it not because it guarantees healing, but because it offers the illusion of control in a world where sickness arrives without warning. And death is never far behind. You are not just a doctor. You are a conjurer of hope, a scholar, suffering, a bearer of leeches, and a wielder of blades. You carry your tools, strange as they are, with pride or at least with habit. You open your bag, and the treatment begins. Or something like it. If you were a medieval doctor, everything you knew about health, everything you had studied, practiced, and believed, rested upon a single ancient idea that the human body was ruled by four fundamental fluids or humors. These humors were not just metaphorical. They were literal liquids inside you, sloshing around, affecting your moods, your complexion, your digestion, and whether you lived or died. The entire theory came from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose works had been passed down through countless centuries, translated, copied by monks, and revered as sacred truths. And so you, doctor of the medieval age, based every diagnosis, every treatment, and every medical explanation on the delicate, mysterious balance of four squishy, smelly substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Let's take them one at a time, because understanding these fluids wasn't just academic, it was your professional compass. First, there was blood. Bright, red, and lively. Blood was considered the humor of vitality. Too much blood made a person cheerful, energetic, even a little reckless. You'd describe them as sanguine. They had rosy cheeks and a warm demeanor. But if blood became excessive, it could also cause fevers, inflammation, or restlessness. The cure? Bleed them, of course. Or apply cooling herbs. You were forever chasing that perfect middle ground enough blood to feel alive. Not so much that. You boiled from within. Then there was phlegm, the cool, pale, wet humor. Phlegm ruled over calmness, sluggishness, and apathy. People with too much phlegm were called phlegmatic, slow, quiet, possibly dull. A deeply ill person with pale skin and clammy hands might be diagnosed as suffering from phlegmatic imbalance. The treatment might involve warming the body with hot broths, mustard plasters, or spices like pepper and ginger, or perhaps a good purge just to make sure the system was cleansed. You'd probably recommend avoiding cold baths and melancholy music. Just to be safe, yellow bile was hot and dry, associated with aggression, ambition, and sharp temperaments. Those with too much of it were considered choleric. They had sharp features, piercing eyes, and a tendency to snap at others. They were prone to anger, fevers, jaundice, and digestive issues. You might see a patient with a high fever and a bitter taste in the mouth and declare, "Choler is high." The remedy might include cooling tonics, bitter herbs, or even bloodletting to draw away the heat. A strict diet would follow, and you might counsel the patient to avoid excessive arguments, as that would only stir the bile further. And finally, there was black bile, perhaps the most mysterious of all. Cold and dry, black bile was the humor of sadness, introspection, and despair. A person dominated by black bile was melancholic. They were quiet, thoughtful, possibly depressed. In physical terms, black bile was blamed for tumors, chronic illness, and digestive sluggishness. Treatments for melancholia included warming the body, encouraging cheerful music, and avoiding solitude. You might also prescribe a strong herbal laxative, believing that this dark fluid could be physically purged from the gut. Whether or not it worked, the theory was persuasive. These four humors weren't just about physical health. They explained personality, behavior, mood, and even destiny. Every person, it was believed, was born with a particular temperament based on their dominant humor. A good doctor like you had to read the signs. Was the patient flushed and energetic? That was blood, pale and shivering, phlegm, restless and yellow-eyed, choler, brooding and slow to speak, black bile. It was like astrology, but wetter. The humors were also tied to the seasons, elements, and body parts. Blood was aligned with spring, air, and the heart. Phlegm went with winter, water, and the brain. Yellow bile matched summer, fire, and the liver. Black bile corresponded to autumn, earth, and the spleen. The entire body, every cough, boil, rash, and spasm could be mapped onto this grand symmetrical system. You weren't just treating a stomach ache. You were addressing an elemental imbalance in the cosmos of the human body. And yes, that meant everything. And we do mean everything was treated through the lens of balancing these fluids. Too much of one. You'd bleed, purge, sweat, or starve. And out, too little. You'd prescribe foods, herbs, or activities to raise it. Even dreams were linked to humors. Nightmares could be blamed on a buildup of choler. Sad dreams suggested black bile. So if your patient said they dreamed of drowning in a swamp or weeping uncontrollably while picking dead flowers, you took that seriously. You didn't have Freud. You had phlegm. The problem, of course, was that none of this actually reflected how the body works. But in the medieval mind, it felt right. It was orderly. It was symmetrical. It gave meaning to suffering. If someone had a fever, you didn't need to know about bacteria. You just needed to know that the body was overheated, probably full of excess blood or bile and needed to be cooled. That might mean bleeding from the forearm, applying cold compresses, or feeding the patient a diet of lettuce and barley water. If someone was listless and pale, you prescribe warming tonics, thick soups, or long walks in the sun. The results were unpredictable, but the system offered a sense of control in a world where illness struck without warning. Some doctors even created charts and wheels to help keep it all straight. These were hand-drawn diagrams that listed the qualities of each humor: hot, cold, wet, dry, think. They'd show how the humors interacted with the seasons, the zodiac, the elements, and the phases of the moon. These were not just classroom tools. You might carry a smaller version in your pouch or on a wax tablet, consulting it before making decisions. Should you bleed the patient now or wait until the moon is waning? Is this cough coming from the chest, the brain, or the spleen? You could refer to your chart, frown thoughtfully, and declare that the patient was suffering from a phlegmatic disturbance in the winter season, worsened by Saturn's influence. It sounded impressive even if it didn't help. Even treatments as simple as diet and lifestyle were humor-driven. Foods were classified by their qualities. Cheese was cold and moist. Wine was hot and dry. Cabbage was cold and dry, but better, if boiled. Eating according to your dominant humor was considered essential. A choleric person needed cooling foods. A melancholic needed warm, moist meals to lift their spirits. If your patient insisted on eating salted pork and hard cheese every day, you might warn them that they were inviting imbalance. Illness was not just a physical event. It was a reflection of personal choices and inner harmony. Or lack thereof as a doctor. You became skilled in interpreting fluids. Blood wasn't just blood. It could be thick or thin, dark or bright, clotted or flowing. Each quality told you something. Vomit, sputum, urine, sweat, each had its own language. You didn't just see a fever. You saw rising heat. You didn't just hear a cough. You heard phlegm trying to escape. Every smell, color, and texture became part of your diagnosis. The human body, for all its groans and drips, was a kind of messy manuscript you were trying to read, and so you practiced your art day after day, tending to the sick and the desperate, always searching for balance in a world full of imbalance. You consulted your books, mixed your herbs, adjusted your patients' diets, and sometimes sliced open their veins to let the heat escape. You watched as they bled, sweated, vomited, or purged. Sometimes they got better. Often they didn't. But you always had an explanation. Their bile was too thick. Their blood was too strong. Their phlegm had turned sour. The system was never wrong. It just hadn't been applied properly. There's something strangely poetic about it. The idea that the human body is like a miniature cosmos made of elements, ruled by seasons, shaped by balance and discord. It was a comforting fiction in a chaotic world, and one that you, doctor of the old world, clung to because there was nothing better. It made illness feel manageable. It made medicine feel possible, even when the outcome was death. The process felt like progress, and so you carried your knowledge from patient to patient, never quite certain, but always convinced. You bled the angry, warmed the sluggish, purged the sorrowful, and cooled the inflamed. You believed that inside every body was a delicate symphony of fluids, and your job, your calling, was to keep them in tune. Whether by blade, herb, or prayer you tried, that was the best medicine could offer, Doc. It's another quiet morning in your practice quiet. Except for the distant coughing from a nearby alley, the faint sound of a priest chanting psalms in the square, and the clink of glass as you examine your latest diagnostic tool, a bottle of someone else's urine. Yes, if you are a medieval doctor, there are two things you will almost certainly be using to diagnose your patient's condition: the stars above and the golden fluid below. It is not your patient's heartbeat, blood pressure, or X-ray scan that guides your decisions. No, it is the pale gleam of sunlight through a flask of warm pee and the distant placement of mercury in the house of sorrow that will shape your diagnosis, Doc, to start. Let's talk about the urine. It is a strangely central part of your medical practice, more so than any other bodily substance. While blood, bile, and phlegm all play their roles in your understanding of illness, urine is the most portable, the most examinable, and the most mystically revealing. Patients would travel to your door, not bringing their bodies, but rather a carefully saved container of urine, often wrapped in cloth and still faintly steaming from the morning's collection. Some might think this odd, but to you, this is completely normal. You might even prefer it. Why visit a sick person and risk breathing in miasmas when you can simply stare at their fluids in your study, next to your candles and dried rosemary? You begin the examination by holding the flask up to the light, turning it slowly, watching how the color shifts in the sun. This is not just casual observation, it is a performance, a ritual. You frown in concentration, tilt your head, and let the light play through the amber, straw yellow, or muddy brown liquid. The medieval doctor's urine wheel, a chart of colors and meanings, is often consulted at this point. It tells you what each hue might mean. Pale yellow might suggest weakness. A reddish tint might indicate heat in the liver. A milky cloud could be phlegmatic residue. Blackened urine? That's a terrible sign. Death might already be in the room. Then comes the smell test. It is unpleasant but necessary. You may unstopper the flask and gently wave your hand over it, drawing the scent toward your nose like a perfumer. A sharp vinegary smell could suggest a fever. A foul, rotten odor might hint at intestinal corruption. Sometimes, in your more daring moments, you may even taste a drop. Yes, medieval doctors were known to do this. Not frequently, but enough that it was documented. A sweet taste, for example, could indicate diabetes, even though the word didn't exist in your vocabulary yet. You might just call it excess sweetness and nod solemnly. What's truly fascinating, or perhaps unsettling, is how much you can infer, or claim to infer, from just this one substance. Urine was considered a distillation of the body's inner workings, a mirror to the soul and stomach alike. It was the safest way to study a patient without touching them. In a world with no microscopes or blood tests, a glass flask of warm fluid seemed like a scientific gift. And patients believed in it just as much as you did. Many expected a full diagnosis just from the inspection of their urine. They didn't need to be examined themselves, just their golden offering. Now. While your right hand holds a urine flask, your left may be sketching astrological charts. Yes, in the medieval world, the heavens were as important as the humors. If someone was born under Mars, that told you something. If Venus was in retrograde during their illness, that told you even more. The stars, it was believed, influenced. the body just as they influenced the tides and the harvests. Astrology was not some side hobby or pseudoscience. It was medical doctrine, respected and referenced in the most serious cases. Before beginning a treatment, especially a dangerous one like bloodletting, you would consult the patient's natal chart. You need to know their exact time and place of birth. With that, you could determine which planets ruled their organs, which days were auspicious for treatment, and when danger loomed, Saturn might be linked to the spleen. The moon, of course, ruled over fluids and emotions. Mercury influenced the mind. The position of the sun on the day of treatment could determine whether your surgery would succeed or whether you'd be blamed for their death. The complexity of these calculations could be staggering. You might consult a large leather-bound almanac filled with planetary movements and predictions. You draw careful circles, place symbols for each planet and zodiac sign, and mark the influence of each house. Then, with great expression, you'd nod and say, "Now is not the time to bleed him. Wait until the moon wanes." To your patient, this would sound like divine knowledge. To you, it felt like guidance in an otherwise uncertain world. There were other factors to consider too. Days of the week had medical significance. Monday was ruled by the moon. Tuesday by Mars. Each day influenced certain organs, moods, and outcomes. If a patient fell ill on a Wednesday, it might be seen as a sign that their illness had a mental cause. Mercury ruled the mind, after all. If someone bled from the nose on a Friday, you might treat it differently than if they bled on a Sunday. Superstition? Yes, but deeply woven into the very fabric of medicine at the time. This reliance on astrology might seem silly from a modern viewpoint, but it served a very real purpose. It gave the doctor a framework for timing, a way to plan treatments, and a way to explain delays or failures. If a patient died despite your best efforts, you could say the stars were unfavorable. If they recovered miraculously, you might credit Jupiter's benevolence. Either way, it gave your work an air of inevitability, as though you were merely a humble interpreter of cosmic will. In some towns and regions, the combination of urine reading and astrology became its own niche profession. You could become known as a physician who never touched a patient, yet diagnosed with eerie precision. People would queue outside your home, each clutching a flask of their own making, waiting for you to lift it to the light, sniff thoughtfully, and consult the sky. The room you worked in might be filled with shelves of labeled urine flasks, their colors fading as they aged. You would take notes in careful Latin script, noting the position of the stars on the hour of arrival, and prescribe fennel tea and fasting based on the movement of Venus. Some towns even employed professional uroscopists, individuals whose sole job was to examine urine and advise the more hands-on doctors. These specialists had no need for patients, just samples. They became quite famous. One story tells of a woman who sent her urine sample across 3 counties just to receive a diagnosis from a particular uroscopist. He replied with a note, "You are pregnant." She was indeed. Whether by luck or skill, such predictions added to the mythos of the urine-reader dot, of course. Not every diagnosis was correct. Many patients died. Many treatments failed. But the systems of urine and stars offered a sense of order, a map of invisible truths. You weren't stabbing blindly in the dark. You were following charts, signs, and fluids. You believed in what you were doing. So did your patients. And sometimes, belief itself did more than any potion. Even when you did finally touch the patient, perhaps to lance a boil, apply a poultice, or drain a blister, you would still return to the pea and the planets before the day was through. They were your compass, your stethoscope, your x-ray machine. And you, the medieval doctor, were their solemn interpreter. You'd end your day back in your study, flasks arranged in rows, the stars wheeling overhead in the quiet dark. You'd dip your quill in ink and write a final note. Patience, urine deep yellow, thick, with floating sediment. Mars ascendant, no bleeding today. You'd sigh, snuff the candle, and go to bed with the vague hope that tomorrow's samples might be less alarming. There are few procedures in medieval medicine more iconic or more gruesome than bloodletting. If you were a doctor during these centuries of dim candlelight and moldering manuscripts, you would almost certainly reach for your lancet at the first sign of illness. Whether your patient complained of fatigue, dizziness, swelling, melancholy, or any number of vague symptoms, your first instinct would be to remove blood. Why? Because the ancient belief that disease stemmed from an imbalance of humors chief. Among them, too much blood was the cornerstone of your entire medical worldview. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. If the body was sick because it had too much of one thing, the obvious cure was to take some of it out in a corner of your workspace. You would keep a small wooden chest, the tools of your bloody trade, neatly arranged inside, curved knives, slender lancets, coarse linen bandages, and a few worn ceramic bowls, each darkened by the memory of past patients. There might also be leeches kept in damp cloths or glass jars, writhing slowly as they waited for the warmth of living flesh. These were your instruments of healing, though by modern standards, they resembled torture devices more than tools of care. Still, to you, they were sacred part of your ritual and your profession, passed down from the ancients. Your patients might be nervous, of course. Some had bled before. Some had fainted. Some had relatives who never quite recovered from a previous session, but they came anyway. They believed in the process. The belief that bloodletting could cure nearly anything was deeply ingrained. It wasn't a last resort. It was often the first. The ritual began with choosing the vein. This was not a random decision. Entire charts and manuals were devoted to determining which vein should be opened for which illness. A headache? Perhaps. The veins near the temples. Lung congestion? You might bleed from the inner arm. Liver problems? Try the foot. If the patient was a woman, different rules applied. Some doctors believed that bleeding from the ankle could help regulate menstrual flow, while others suggested a different vein for cases of hysteria, melancholy, or childbearing issues. These choices were made with the confidence of science, though they were grounded in theory more than evidence. Once the spot was chosen, you would seat the patient in a sturdy chair or lay them on a bench. A bowl would be placed below, ready, to catch the dark flow. You tie a cloth tightly around the limb to engorge the vein, then carefully, sometimes clumsily, insert the blade. The blood would spurt or trickle, depending on your aim and the patient's condition. You would observe it not just for volume, but for color and consistency. Was it bright red or dark and sluggish? Was it clotted or smooth? These observations guided your next steps. Was more needed? Should you stop now? Sometimes the patient would grow pale and woozy. This was considered a positive sign evidence that the excess blood was leaving. If they passed out, you might splash water on them or wave a sprig of herbs under their nose. In rare cases, the bleeding didn't stop. Hemorrhaging was always a risk, especially if the patient was weak to begin with. But even then, you might not blame yourself. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps the stars had aligned poorly that day. Or perhaps the illness had simply progressed too far. You wipe your blade, wrap the arm, and offer a few words of comfort, confident that you had done your part. The amount of blood removed varied, but it could be substantial. A half liter or more was common. Some patients were bled multiple times a week. Others came in for seasonal bloodletting routine sessions to maintain balance and stave off future disease. Entire communities would schedule group bleedings during Lent or other holy times, believing it to be a kind of purification, both physical and spiritual, in some hospitals and monasteries. The process became ceremonial. Monks might bleed according to the calendar, rotating turns like clockwork. There were even professional barber surgeons whose duties included shaving beards, pulling teeth, and bleeding patients. The famous red and white barber pole, it symbolizes blood and bandages. These barber surgeons were the most practical of all medical practitioners, less concerned with theory and more focused on the mechanical act itself. Their work was rough, fast, and rarely gentle, but effective in the only sense medieval people understood. Something had been done. Leeches were the gentler alternative, though not necessarily less disturbing. You'd apply several to the skin usually. around the temples, behind the ears, or on inflamed limbs, and let them attach. They would suck slowly, painlessly at first, but then with surprising efficiency. Patients often found them horrifying, the sight of small creatures feasting on. Their blood was not exactly comforting, but for some conditions, especially those involving swelling leeches, were favored. They were thought to be intelligent in their own way, taking only what was needed. In truth, they just kept going until they were full. After the bleeding, patients were often left weak, dizzy, and nauseated. You might prescribe rest, broth, or a warming herbal tonic. If they didn't improve, more bloodletting could be suggested, or purging, or sweating. You were not giving up. You were trying all the tools available to you. Few though they were in times of epidemic, bloodletting took on a new level of desperation. During outbreaks of plague, bleeding was sometimes used even on the already deathly ill. The logic was that draining infected blood might stop the spread inside the body. Of course, in reality, it often hastened death. A body already ravaged by an infection could hardly survive the loss of another pint of blood. But at the time, you didn't know that. You believed you were helping. You had to believe it. Otherwise, your entire profession would collapse under the weight of its own futility. There were critics, even then. A few voices questioned whether so much blood should be lost so often. Some suggested that the humors could be balanced through other means: diet, prayer, music, or even lifestyle. But those were fringe ideas. The mainstream medical consensus, reinforced by centuries of books, teachers, and tradition, was that bloodletting worked. And so you continued bowl after bowl, year after year. And what of the patients? They rarely resisted. Some feared the procedure, yes. Some wept. But most accepted it, just as people accept any treatment that promises hope. They wanted relief, and this was the best the age could offer. If the doctor said bleed, they bled. If the doctor said again, they came back. And if they died, well, their families said prayers and blamed sin or fate or the alignment of Mars dot as the centuries rolled on. Bloodletting would persist, even into the early modern period. Generations of doctors performed it. Kings were bled. Nobles were bled. Soldiers, farmers, monks, widows, children. Everyone at one time or another felt the sting of the blade and the soft rush of warmth as life trickled into a bowl. It was medicine as much as it was ritual, a shared cultural act of healing misunderstanding and submission to the unknown. You, the medieval doctor, were part of this long tradition. You didn't just wield a knife. You held authority, confidence, and the weight of the past in your hands. You sliced, drained, and bandaged not because you were cruel, but because it was all you knew. You believed in the red flow. You trusted the theory. And for a moment, when the blood ran freely, you felt like you were making a difference. And maybe in a strange way, you were dot. There are a few phrases more quietly horrifying than medieval surgery, and for good reason. If you were a doctor, or more often a barber surgeon in the Middle Ages, and your patient needed something removed, repaired, stitched, or cut in two, there was no polite way around it. There were no numbing injections, no gas, no gentle lull into unconsciousness. There was no anesthesia at all. Surgery was a test of endurance for you, yes, but more so for the unfortunate soul lying on the table. It was, in essence, an event of screaming, blood, frantic praying, and hope. Hope that you'd be fast, that the wound wouldn't fester, and that the patient would wake up the next morning, if they ever slept again. The very idea of cutting open the human body was treated with a mixture of awe and dread. Most doctors preferred not to do it at all. Surgery was considered a lowly manual task, not a profession for the intellectually elite. The educated physicians, trained in Latin texts and astrological charts, kept their hands clean. They would diagnose, prescribe herbs, and recommend lifestyle changes. But if someone needed a boil lanced, a limb amputated, or a wound stitched, They'd send in the barber surgeon, often a robust man with strong arms and a cloth apron that hadn't been properly washed in years. Your tools were few and frightening. Knives of varying lengths and curves, bone saws with coarse teeth, iron probes, cautery irons heated over oaken flames, hooks, and perhaps a pair of forceps if you were lucky. They had no precision, no ergonomic handles, no surgical steel. Most were forged by blacksmiths, and many were indistinguishable from tools used on livestock. Yet these were the instruments of life and death when a patient came to you, grimacing, with pain, perhaps with a shattered leg, a festering abscess, or a crushed finger. You assessed their condition not with scans or tests, but with your eyes and nose. You'd look at the wound, poke it lightly, and sniff. A foul odor was a bad sign. Blackened skin meant death had already begun to creep in. If the tissue could not be saved, you'd announce that amputation was the only answer. And this is where the nightmare began. The surgery would begin quickly. There was no luxury of time. The patient would be restrained, sometimes by assistants, sometimes by family members, or even by leather straps. You might give them a wooden stick or a piece of cloth to bite on, maybe a strong drink of ale or wine, and if you were feeling generous, a short prayer. But make no mistake, they would feel every single moment. And so would everyone else in the room. Amputation was the most dramatic and terrifying procedure. You had to be fast. Some accounts say skilled surgeons could remove a leg in under 2 minutes. You'd slice quickly through the skin and muscle, exposing the bone. Then you'd saw through it as fast as possible, trying not to splinter or slip. The sound was awful, a mix of sawing wood and muffled screams. Once the limb was off, you cauterized the stump with a red-hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Sometimes the patient fainted from shock. Sometimes they screamed until their throat gave out. Other surgeries were smaller, but no less brutal. Boils and abscesses were common. You'd lance them with a blade, squeeze out the pus, and pack the wound with herbs or cloth. If the infection was deep, you'd probe inside with iron tools, blindly seeking the source. This was done without washing your hands or cleaning your instruments. You worked by touch and by faith. The risk of further infection was always high. Particularly gruesome procedure was trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, remove bad spirits, or treat head injuries. The tools were crude, often resembling corkscrews or sharp chisels. You'd scrape or drill slowly, peeling away the layers of bone while your patient sat rigid, likely restrained by rope and trembling with fear. There were no antiseptics, just your hand, the tool, and a prayer. And somehow, astonishingly, some patients survived. Bladder stones were another medieval nightmare. If someone had trouble urinating and complained of intense pain, you might suspect a stone. The procedure to remove it involved inserting long metal instruments into the urethra, cutting open the perineum, and reaching inside to pull the stone out. This was often done on children who were more likely to develop stones due to poor diet. There was no pain relief, just restraint and endurance. Death from shock or infection was common, but occasionally the child lived and the doctor was hailed as a miracle worker. For women, gynecological surgery was even more mysterious and dangerous. Female anatomy was poorly understood, and childbirth was considered more of a midwife's domain. But when something went wrong, like a retained placenta or prolapse, a male surgeon might be summoned. The procedures were often blind, invasive, and desperate. The tools weren't designed for the female body. They were simply the same knives, hooks, and tongs used for everything else. In rare cases, more sophisticated procedures were attempted. Some medieval surgeons, inspired by ancient texts, tried to repair hernias, set broken bones with splints, or drain fluid from the chest. They would stitch wounds using catgut or linen thread, often without cleaning the area first. The success of these procedures was a matter of luck. If the wound didn't fester, the patient might survive. If it did, death would come slowly, accompanied by fever, delirium, and the ever-present scent of rotting flesh. What strikes you most, as a doctor of this time, is how public it all is. Surgery isn't done in quiet, sterile rooms. It happens in people's homes, in open courtyards, or in back rooms of busy inns. Bystanders may watch. Family members may cry. Children may peek through the door. There's no privacy, no sterile field, no calm pre-op discussion. There's only necessity and noise. The work must be done, and you must do it because no one else will dot after the operation. Aftercare is rudimentary. You might bind the wound with strips of cloth soaked in wine or vinegar. You might apply a poultice made of honey, herbs, or mash roots. You tell the patient to rest, to eat warm porridge, to night air. If infection set in, you might bleed them again, or apply a leech, or whisper a prayer. You hoped for the best. You had no antibiotics. Just experience, ritual, and persistence. And yet, in this bloody, brutal world, a strange sort of courage emerges. Patients submitted themselves to procedures they knew would hurt more than anything they'd ever felt. Surgeons performed these operations with shaking hands and steady faces, trying not to show fear. Everyone involved was bound by necessity, by desperation, and by the quiet. Shared understanding that life was short and fragile, and pain was the price of trying to extend it. You, the medieval surgeon, were not a monster. You were a product of your time. You did what you could with what you had. Your patients trusted you, even as they screamed beneath your blade. And when the cutting was over, when the wound was bound, and the room had gone quiet again, you wiped your hands on your apron, packed your tools, and moved on to the next house, the next case, the next desperate soul hoping that pain might lead. Somehow, to healing dot in the soft, flickering candlelight of your study. You sit with a furrowed brow and ink-stained hands, paging through brittle texts filled with diagrams of strange symbols and stylized human organs. You're trying to make sense of anything that explains why your latest patient is coughing blood, or why the baker's child has erupted in black spots and hasn't stopped vomiting. You think it's a disturbance of the humors, perhaps too much bile or corrupted phlegm. You consider the stars, the smell of the air, the recent diet of the afflicted. But no matter how long you stare at the parchment or consult the heavens, the truth is always the same. You don't really understand the diseases you're trying to treat. Not truly. You know their symptoms, their stages, even their sense, but not their cause. Every medieval doctor faced this unsettling truth. Despite the confidence of your charts and the authority of your robes, disease was still a mystery cloaked. In fear, you could see it and feel it, but never quite grasp it. It could be carried on a breeze, buried in bad food sent by God, or bubbling up from a swamp. One day your town is healthy. The next, people are dying in alleys. The uncertainty is what made disease so terrifying and your job so desperate. Let's start with the worst, the plague. Bubonic plague was not just a disease. It was a biblical level horror, and when it arrived, it was like the world turned to rot overnight. You might remember the signs. The swelling of the lymph nodes into large, oozing buboes, the high fevers, vomiting, delirium, and the ghastly blackening of the skin. You would hear the stories before you ever saw it. Entire households dead in a week, carts rolling down the street filled with corpses. The silence of churches that once rang with chants. And when the first patient arrived at your door, you knew it was already too late. Your tools are useless. No bleeding, purging, or prayer could stop it. You tried anyway, of course. You applied poultices to the swellings. You offered vinegar and rose water. You burned sweet herbs to cleanse the air. But the disease moved faster than your hands, faster than your thoughts. Some doctors wore long-beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs, believing the stench of death was the cause. Others fled altogether. You might stay, treating as many as you could, helplessly watching them die one by one, their faces locked in frozen agony. You would survive, maybe, but something inside you wouldn't. And yet, even when plague receded, there were plenty of other ailments that bewildered you. Leprosy, for instance. It terrified people as much as the plague. not because it killed swiftly, but because it lingered. Slowly, the body changed, losing sensation, spreading lesions, deforming hands and feet. Patients became strangers to their own skin. You might diagnose it based on how their face looked or whether they could feel a needle prick. But what caused it? Some said sign, some said bad blood. Others believed it was punishment for lust or heresy. You might try herbal washes or simply send the sufferer to a leper house, a quiet place far outside the village, where they could fade, away unseen. Then there were the common illnesses, less dramatic, but constant, relentless. You treated fevers all the time. Hot fevers, cold fevers, intermittent fevers. Each had a place in your theory of humors, but none had a clear cause. A child might burn with heat for 3 days, then recover like nothing happened. Another might grow pale and weak over weeks, only to die quietly one morning with no visible wound. You chalked it up to imbalance, or perhaps the stars, but really, it was just something you didn't know. Coughs and chest pain were frequent. Visitors, you called it catarrh or a phlegmatic disturbance. You heard wheezing, and you'd warm the chest with compresses. You fed the patient warm wine or barley water, but sometimes the cough deepened, turned red, and the patient began coughing. Blood, you called it consumption. Today, it would be tuberculosis. Then, it was an ominous sentence, often leading to slow death. You might recommend isolation, rest, and prayers to Saint Sebastian, patron of plague and pestilence. But you could offer no true cure. Stomach pains were another constant mystery. Everything from food poisoning to appendicitis to gallstones all looked the same to you. Cramping, vomiting, sometimes bleeding. You'd prescribe fasting, then a purgative. If the vomiting stopped, you'd claim victory. If not, you might recommend prayer or bleeding. You had no idea that spoiled meat or parasites were the real culprits. In fact, the concept of germs didn't exist. Illness was thought to arise from miasma, foul air, or internal corruption. The unseen world of bacteria was centuries away. One particularly mysterious condition was the falling sickness, what we now know as epilepsy. When a person collapsed suddenly, their limbs jerking, their mouth foaming, and their eyes rolled back, the crowd would recoil. Was it a demon? Punishment? A sign from heaven? You might say it was a brain imbalance or excessive cold humor. But more often than not, you'd recommend holy water or an exorcism. It was more spiritual than medical. You didn't have tools to understand it, so you explained it the only way you knew, through myth, religion, and fear. There were madnesses, two people who laughed too much, talked to the air, wandered naked in the fields, or wept uncontrollably for days. You didn't have a word for depression, schizophrenia, or mania. You had melancholy and lunacy. The moon was blamed for some of it. Too much black bile for the rest. Treatment might be a warm bath, music, or bleeding. In worse cases, the afflicted were locked away. You pitied them maybe, but you couldn't help them. Even simple injuries could become mortal. A cut from a rusty scythe, a broken leg, a dog bite. Without understanding infection, you might wrap the wound in herbs and bandage it tightly, unaware that you were sealing. In bacteria, when the wound turned black or began to ooze foul-smelling pus, you call it corruption, gangrene. If the limb could be removed, you tried. If not, you watched as fever set in, and your patient slipped away, delirious and moaning. You tried to understand patterns. Disease struck harder in summer, especially in the cities. You noticed that poor people got sick more often than nobles. You observed that bad smells often accompanied sickness. These were important observations, but without microscopes, without germ theory, without even the idea of viral transmission, you were left guessing. All you had was what you could see, smell, hear, and imagine. And you imagined a lot to the people who came to you. You were a figure of hope. You wore robes. You spoke Latin. You had books. But inside, you often felt powerless. You recited ancient cures that rarely worked. You diagnosed based on theories older than your grandfather. You prayed the night before treating a plague victim, and you washed your hands only to remove the blood, not the disease. Still, you worked. You tried. You listened to the coughing and the weeping. You opened your door to the bleeding and the feverish. You packed herbs, counted stars, bled arms, and studied urine. You believed that balance could be restored, even if the means were crude. You knew more than the peasants, but less than you wished. You stood in the space between life and death, clutching a satchel of dried plants and heart full of guesses, and when the sun set and the candles burned low, you sighed deeply. Another day of not knowing. Another day of doing what little you could. Tomorrow you would try again. Because for all that you couldn't understand, you understood one thing perfectly. People needed you. Even when you had nothing to offer but a bandage, a bitter drink, and a quiet hand on the shoulder. If you're a medieval doctor, then your life is live nose first. Before you say a word, before you lift a single blade, your senses are overwhelmed. Your world is a barrage of odors and sounds so constant, so layered, so utterly human, that you stop noticing only by learning to live inside them. You awaken, not to silence, but to coughing in the courtyard, groaning from the neighboring chamber, and the wet, dull thud of someone retching into a bucket. These are the rhythms of your day. They follow you like your own shadow, from house to house, patient to patient, wherever sickness is festering, and it is always festering somewhere. Let us begin with the smells, because they come first, always. Step into your workspace, and you're greeted not by the crisp tang of antiseptic, but by a muddle of wine-soaked cloth, stale blood, old sweat, and pungent herbs that lost their fragrance weeks ago. There is the lingering trace of smoke from the last cauterization, the iron tang of the lancet blade you forgot to wash, the faint but unmistakable rot of flesh that has gone just a bit too far. Now. Your patients bring their own scents, of course. A peasant woman who hasn't bathed in weeks but arrives wrapped in wool and fear. Her hair reeks of soot, her breath of sour milk and despair. You lean in anyway, because you have to, and because her wound won't clean itself. Or maybe it's the old man from the monastery. He smells of damp earth, incense, and infected foot ulcers. They all smell of something, and you, the doctor, must breathe it in. Because healing, such as it is in your time, cannot be done at a distance. Urine is its own category of aroma. You keep flasks of it on your shelf, labeled by name and date, as if it were fine wine, and it ages poorly. Some samples sour quickly, becoming acidic and sharp. Others develop a strange meaty staleness, like broth left out in the sun. And yet, you swirl and sniff, studying its secrets. You don't flinch anymore. You've learned to find patterns in the stink, and confidence in the cloudiness. Pus, on the other hand, is a problem. The draining of boils is common work. A daily task. You lance the swelling, press firmly, and out comes a foul-smelling mix of yellow-green, sometimes brown sludge. It coats your fingers, it soaks into your sleeve, and the smell sticks to your hands long after you've rinsed them in vinegar. You try not to gag. You breathe through your mouth. And then you repeat the process for the next patient. You've grown used to the scent of blood, both fresh and old. You can tell the difference by now. Fresh blood is metallic, sharp, and almost clean compared to the rest of your day. Old blood, dried into linen or congealed in a corner, has a heavier, stickier scent. The scent of things not healing. It clings to your robes. When you sleep, it lingers on your pillow. You no longer try to scrub it out, and when death comes, because it always does, the smell changes entirely. It's subtle at first, a damp, sour breath, then stronger. Skin becomes waxy, the air turns thick, and a kind of sweetness enters the room, as if the body itself is fermenting. You've known this scent since your earliest days, and now it fills your clinic with a quiet finality. There is nothing left to do but close the eyes and clean the linens for someone else. And then there are the sounds, a chorus of groans, hacking coughs, and whispered prayers. The hacking is constant. A wet, rattling cough that comes from the lungs of children. the elderly, the overworked. You hear it in the street, echoing off stone walls. You hear it behind doors, in chapels, even in dreams. The worst coughs end with silence, that sharp, sudden stop that tells you someone just died. The cries of pain are louder. During surgeries, they're sharp, animalistic. A man being bled might grunt and grip the chair. A child having an abscess. Drained will shriek. Sometimes people scream your name as if blaming you for the pain. Sometimes they scream God's. You learn to work through it. It's a soundtrack you never turn off. Some patients mutter nonsense in fevered delirium. They speak to people who aren't there. They chant prayers in Latin or weep and laugh in the same breath. These are not the moments they taught you about in your medical training, but they become familiar. You begin to speak to the fever as if it were a person. You plead with it to pass. You whisper to the patient like a priest, not a doctor. Because in these moments, medicine feels like magic that never quite works. There are also the mundane sounds, the squelch of fluid from a wound, the snapping of a bone reset in place, the hiss of hot iron against flesh when you cauterize a stump. And worst of all, the silence when someone stops breathing, when the room goes still except for your own heartbeat in your ears. Now, what are the textures? They too are part of the daily grossness. Linen soaked with blood, bandages that harden into crusted shapes. You wrap wounds with cloth that's been boiled, if you're lucky. But sometimes you use old rags. They stick. They tear skin when removed. You do it anyway because it's all you have. You touch bodies constantly. Swollen limbs, foul sores, eyes glued shut with pus, gums that bleed when you press them. You reach into wounds. You hold a man's hand as he dies, and moments later reach into his mouth to check for a missing tooth. There's no such thing as gloves. Only your bare hands, your sleeves, your apron, and the occasional splash of wine for washing. Eating after. Work is difficult. You sit down to stale bread and stew, but your hands smell like and your sleeves are stained. You chew slowly, trying not to recall the last patient's breath or the thick fluid that oozed down your wrist. You drink heavily sometimes, not to celebrate, just to forget what your nose and ears endured all day. Even the tools have their own sort of filth. You wipe your blades on cloth. Maybe you rinse them, maybe not. The dried blood on the handle is yours. The rust? That's just age. But they still work, and that's what matters. You'd use them again tomorrow. You do not complain. There is no one to complain to. This is your calling. You carry the knowledge, such as it is. You bear the weight of the dying and the stink. Of their passing. Your life is not clean, and never will be. But you are needed. You are the only line between suffering and silence. And that matters, even if no one thanks you for it in the end. The grossness becomes a kind of wallpaper. You stop seeing it. You stop smelling it. It becomes normal, like rain or dirt or church bells. You live inside it, and when you close your eyes at night, you dream not of clean rooms and sterile tools, but of the work of the coughs, the cries, the blood, and the strange, persistent hope that tomorrow maybe you'll save one more before you ever held a lancet, before you smelled your first patient's infected wound or bled your first nobleman in a candlelit chamber. You were a student, a reader, a listener, an observer of other men's knowledge. Becoming a medieval doctor was not about experimentation or first-hand discovery. It was about submission to authority, about reverence for ancient texts, about trusting what had been written, not because it worked, but because it had always been written. Your training began not with patients, but with books, heavy ones, bound in leather, filled with crackling vellum pages, and scrawled in Latin, so dense that even some scribes struggled to copy it. These books were the writings of Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and a few select others, whose word had become law in the medical world for centuries. You study humor theory, the idea that the body was ruled by 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each person had a particular mixture of these humors. An illness, it was said, came from imbalance. This was not a theory to be debated. It was the foundation of your education. To doubt it was to doubt medicine itself, you might have studied. At a university, if you were wealthy or fortunate, Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, these were the great centers of learning in Europe. But learning was a relative term. In many ways, you sat through long lectures where a master read aloud from an authoritative text, and you copied it. Then he explained it. Then you memorized it. There were no cadavers on the table. Dissection was rare, and in some places, forbidden outright. Instead, you studied diagrams, flat, symbolic drawings of the human body, where the liver looked like a potato and the brain was just a round shape with a few lines scribbled through it. You knew where things were in theory, but not by sight. Or when dissections did occur, they were solemn affairs, performed on criminals' corpses often only once a year and only with church permission. You watched from a distance as an assistant did the cutting, and a master read aloud from Galen, describing what should be seen. And if the body didn't match the book, well, the body must be wrong, not the book. Because the book came from ancient wisdom, the body was just temporary. Outside the universities, if you were a more hands-on kind of healer or poor, you might learn from an apprenticeship. A village doctor, a barber surgeon, or a wise woman might take you in and teach you there. Methods? This was a more practical education. You learned how to mix poultices from crushed herbs, how to hold a patient still during bloodletting, how to recognize which fevers were fatal and which might pass. There were no textbooks. Just observation, repetition, and the constant threat of getting it wrong. You'd also spend hours copying medical recipes, cures, and treatments that were a blend of folklore. Half-remembered Latin and cautious superstition. You might learn that crushed leeks could cure a snakebite, or that owl blood helped with gout. You might memorize charms and incantations, often mingled with Christian prayers, because healing was not purely physical. It was moral, spiritual, sometimes magical. You learned to balance your belief in science, such as it was, with your fear of sin and the devil dot in the early years. You rarely saw the inside of a patient. Your understanding of disease was external and inferential. You felt the pulse. You looked at the tongue. You sniffed the breath. You swirled the urine in a flask and watched the color dance in the sunlight. You asked the patient what they ate, whether they had been sad lately, whether the moon had looked strange the night before. All of these were legitimate tools in your diagnostic kit, and yet, despite the rigidity of the training, there was a kind of quiet chaos behind it all. Because you were guessing, constantly, not wildly, but systematically. You applied rules that had been passed down for centuries, but you didn't really know why some treatments worked and others failed. When a patient recovered after a bloodletting, you nodded wisely and said it was the proper balance restored. When another bled to death, you muttered about bad humors and timing. You kept going. You had to dot, and while you had your books and your training, you also learned from observation. Slowly, over years, you began to recognize the look of a patient who would not survive. You noticed that certain herbs actually calmed the stomach, even if Galen never mentioned them. You watched as certain poultices helped wounds close. You learned, not because you were supposed to, but because you couldn't ignore what your hands were telling you. Some doctors began keeping personal journals, records of what they'd tried. These became precious things, passed between trusted colleagues like secret maps in the dark. Still, much of what you learned came from other people's bodies. The ones who died under your care, you watched them closely. You saw how a wound swelled before turning black. You observed how the skin looked before a fever became fatal. You learned the hard way that some injuries should be left alone. You didn't speak of this learning out loud. It wasn't part of your official training, but it shaped you more than the lectures ever did, and there were others from whom you learned it, midwives. For example, though not formally trained, they knew more about childbirth than most university physicians. They passed down their knowledge orally, woman to woman, through generations. You might scoff at their methods in public, but in private you often listened. They had a wisdom you could not find in books that you also learned from monks who copied medical texts and guarded ancient manuscripts. Some were healers in their own right, using plants from monastery gardens to treat the sick. Others were philosophers debating whether illness came from sin, stars, or imbalance. Their influence on your education was immense, even if their patients rarely survived, and when all else failed, you learned from failure. From the plague patient who died in spite of every poultice, from the child who didn't survive the purging syrup, from the nobleman who bled too much, too fast. You learned that death was constant, but never simple. That healing was part skill, part luck, and mostly mystery. You never stopped studying. Even late into your career, you reread old texts, scribbled notes in margins, and compared cases with colleagues at feasts or fairs. Sometimes you heard rumors of new methods from distant lands, foreign herbs, Arab physicians with techniques you couldn't pronounce. Some you dismissed as nonsense. Others you adopted, quietly, pretending they had always been part of your own practice. In the end, your education as a medieval doctor was a strange blend of tradition, trial, and trust. You trusted the books, but you also trusted your fingers. You repeated what you were taught, but you also began to ask small questions in the quiet of your mind. Why does this wound heal when wrapped in honey? Why does this patient live while another dies? These questions rarely had answers, but they made you more than a healer. They made you a seeker, however constrained. And so you continued book in hand, sleeves stained, guessing your way through the human body one patient at a time. Not because you knew, but because you needed to believe that knowing was possible. That somewhere in the scribbled Latin or the pulse beneath your thumb, there was truth waiting to be found. If you were a medieval doctor, you didn't just treat symptoms. You stepped into a patient's world made of belief and fear, stories and silence, suffering and submission. You were expected to do more than heal the body, because healing in your time wasn't just a matter of medicine. It was a matter of meaning. People didn't see illness the way we do now. They saw it as punishment or as a test or as something sent from beyond. And as strange as your theories may seem now, you were still a figure of rationality in a world thick with superstition. Which meant that your patients came to you not only with sores and coughs, but with expectations as mysterious and complicated as the diseases themselves. The poor, the laborers, the peasants, they lived close to the earth, to animals, to the raw edge of existence. Illness was part of life, not an interruption to it. When a tooth rotted or a wound festered, they endured it as long as they could. Then, when the pain grew too loud to ignore, they came to you, not because they believed they would be cured, but because you were the last hope. They didn't expect miracles. They expected you to do something. Bleed them, bind the wound, whisper a prayer. If they got better, it was the will of God. If they didn't, that too was the will of God. You were a tool in that divine process. Not the cause of its success or failure. These patients expected discomfort. They didn't ask for gentleness, because they didn't expect it. If you burned the wound with a red-hot iron, they might scream, but they didn't accuse. Pain was the sign that healing was happening, or at least that something was being done. When you stuck them with a needle or drained a boil, they braced themselves. They believed that suffering purged the body. Some even believed it purged the soul. And if they could walk away afterward, limping, scarred, but alive, they considered it a kind of rebirth. Many believed that illness had spiritual causes, and so they sought spiritual solutions. You would often see patients come to you with a pouch of herbs, a small charm tied around their neck, or a prayer scribbled on a scrap of parchment. These were not contradictions to your treatment. They were additions. They wanted your remedies, but they also wanted protection from demons, curses, or angry saints. You, as a doctor, were expected to understand this. You weren't just prescribing. You were participating in a cultural performance of healing, one where medicine and magic walked hand in hand. Some of your patients came not to be healed, but to be heard. They brought stories more than symptoms. A woman might say her sickness began after a bad dream. A man might explain that his leg pain started after he insulted a neighbor. They were giving you the shape of their illness, not just its surface. And you, in turn, were supposed to make sense of it, to draw the line between the invisible world and the visible wound. You listened carefully, even when what they said made no sense. Because healing began with being believed, there was also silence. So much silence. Many people didn't know how to describe what they felt or didn't dare to. They'd sit stiffly in your chair, whispering that they had a heaviness or that their insides felt not right. Women, especially, were often silent about their pain. They were told to bear it. Childbirth, bleeding, swelling, exhaustion. It was all expected. Men bled publicly. Women bled quietly. You had to learn to read their eyes, their posture, the way they folded their hands. Diagnosis was as much intuition as it was tradition. When patients did speak, they often used metaphors. A stomach wasn't hurting, it was gripping like a snake. A headache wasn't pain, it was a hammer behind the eye. These images were meaningful to them and to you. You matched their stories to your theories. A snake might mean bile. The hammer might mean heat in the blood. The stories guided your treatments. Without scans or charts, these metaphors became your map. If your patient was wealthy, their expectations were more complicated. Nobles wanted explanations. They wanted dignity. They wanted cures that looked impressive with golden ointments, fragrant tinctures, or long Latin names. You were expected to flatter them, even as you diagnosed them. You bled them, but not too much. You prescribed exotic spices, rare herbs, even imported stones believed to draw out poison. They wanted comfort more than pain, so you learned to present discomfort as sophistication. The more elaborate your treatment, the more they believed in it, and their belief, in turn, helped them feel better, or at least feel special dot, and when the disease was clearly fatal. Patients turned not to you, but to God. You might be present, still pressing herbs to the chest, still checking for breath. But your role was already fading. The priest arrived. Last rites were spoken. The patient confessed sins, sometimes with you standing silently beside them, holding their pulse, which slowed with each prayer. You weren't offended. You knew your place. Medicine could only go so far. The rest belonged to heaven. There was also the matter of shame. Certain conditions, especially those involving the genitals or the mind, were spoken of in whispers or not at all. A young man might wait until his sores were too painful to walk. A woman might say nothing about her bleeding until she was too weak to stand. Madness was often hidden entirely. Families brought loved ones to you in the dead of night, begging you to help but refusing to describe what was wrong. You had to guess. You had to be kind. You had to pretend you understood. You were also seen as a risk. People knew that some doctors made things worse, that a bad bleeding could kill, that a sour herb could burn the throat. You weren't always trusted. In some villages, healers were viewed with suspicion. You could be accused of being a charlatan, or worse of being in league with dark forces. A failed cure might bring not just shame but danger. You learned to be careful with your promises, to nod more than you swore, to offer hope in small doses. In public, your patients rarely questioned you. They respected your position, your robes, your learning, but in private, many believed their grandmother's remedies were just as good. That garlic and wine or a poultice made from sheep dung and butter might heal better than your syrups. And sometimes they were right. You didn't fight this belief. You worked alongside it. Because healing wasn't just what you did, it was what the patient believed was being done. Children feared you. Of course they did. You came with knives and sharp-smelling paste. You spoke in strange words. You sometimes cut them open or bled them while they screamed in their mother's arms. You hated this part. You told yourself it was necessary. But the sound of a child's cry stayed with you longer than any prayer. And yet, despite the fear, the silence, the strangeness you were called upon, people lined up. They knocked on your door. They brought their sick, They're bleeding, they're dying because they hoped, because they had nothing else. And even when they doubted you, they wanted to believe you could make it better. Just a little dot cell. You nodded and you listened. You mixed herbs, bled veins, muttered Latin under your breath. You honored the charm around their neck. You pretended not to smell the rot. You said, "We'll see," more than you said, "I know." You became a doctor not by having answers, but by being there with your stained hands and your quiet presence. You became what your patients needed, even when you had nothing left to give. If you were a doctor in medieval times, your profession lived in the long shadow of faith. Medicine was not a purely physical science, it was a spiritual endeavor. Every cut you made, every potion you stirred, every fever you observed existed, not just in flesh and blood, but in the divine drama between heaven and earth. Illness was not only a symptom of imbalance or misfortune. It could be a message, a warning, a punishment. And as a doctor, you had to navigate the invisible line where healing ended and belief began. People believed that disease came from God, either as a test or as retribution. The body, after all, was made in God's image. If it failed, it must be because something was wrong in the soul. The role of sin was not abstract. If someone fell ill after cheating a neighbor, neglecting their prayers, or harboring impure thoughts, it was understood by many as divine correction. In some villages, illness became a public admission of guilt. The sick were pitied, but also watched had they done something to deserve it. And if you, the physician, treated them, were you helping them or interfering with God's justice? Yes. Belief was not limited to the uneducated. You yourself were taught that the humors were influenced not just by food or weather, but by moral failings. Pride could overheat the blood. Lust might corrupt the liver. Grief could spoil the phlegm. These weren't metaphors, they were accepted truths. And so your diagnoses often included spiritual considerations. A patient's sins, their dreams, their emotions, even the way they prayed, all of it might inform your treatment thought in monasteries. Illness was treated with scripture as much as with salves. Monks cared for the sick as a sacred duty. They laid warm hands on wounds while chanting psalms. They believed that suffering could bring a soul closer to Christ, who himself had bled and suffered. This idea, the sanctity of suffering, was a heavy presence in your practice. You often saw patients who believed their illness was a holy gift, something to endure, not erase. They didn't want to be cured as much as they wanted to be purified. Still, there were saints to call upon. A whole celestial network of specialists. Saint Sebastian was invoked during plagues. Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Saint Roch for skin diseases. Saint Dymphna for madness. Patients wore their medals and relics, clutched them tightly in bed, pressed them to sores and blisters. You never mocked these rituals. Sometimes you did the same yourself. You might hang an amulet over a patient's bed. You might whisper a saint's name when you cut open a swollen leg. Because you knew perhaps better than anyone that your tools could only do so much. The holy wound, too, was an idea you couldn't escape. The image of Christ crucified, bleeding from his side, his hands, his feet. This was not just a theological symbol. It shaped how people thought about the body. The wounds of Christ were seen as portals to salvation. Bleeding in this context wasn't just physical, it was redemptive. You, as a doctor, performed bloodletting not only to balance humors, but in some subtle way, to participate in that spiritual symbolism. Your blade echoed the divine. The blood you spilled had meaning beyond the mortal dot in this religious worldview. Your authority as a physician was never absolute. The church was above. You, if your treatments contradicted church doctrine, you could be accused of heresy. You had to walk carefully. Astrology was useful stars helped determine when to bleed or when to mix a salve. But if you relied on it too heavily, you risked suspicion. If a cure worked too well or seemed unnatural, people whispered, was it divine intervention or sorcery? The line between healer and heretic was thinner than your scalpel's edge. You worked closely with priests, especially at the end of life. When a patient grew pale, weak, and quiet, They often asked for both you and the priest. You might offer a warm compress or a spoonful of syrup, while the priest heard confessions and anointed the forehead. In those moments, your work took a respectful step back. You knew that the real preparation was not for health, but for heaven in. Some hospitals, especially those run by religious orders, the goal was not necessarily to heal, but to comfort. The sick were not seen as projects to fix, but as souls to serve. Clean beds, warm soup, kind voices. That was enough. And often you came to see the wisdom in this. Not every wound could be closed, not every fever broken, but mercy. That could always be offered. For the desperate, there were pilgrimages. If your treatments failed, you might suggest a journey to a holy site, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem. Pilgrims traveled with their ailments, hoping that touching a relic or bathing in sacred water would cure what no doctor could. Some came back healed or believed they were. Others died on the road. You did not discourage these quests. They were part of the treatment too. Even your tools took on a spiritual hue. Your surgical knife might be blessed. Your herb satchel might contain a hidden cross. Some doctors inscribed prayers into the margins of their recipe books. Because you understood, knowledge without humility was dangerous. Healing without reverence was hollow. You were not just cutting flesh, you were entering a sacred space. And then there were miracles rare, but whispered about. A patient you couldn't help who suddenly recovered after a night of prayer. A wound that closed without infection. A child who awoke laughing after days of fever. You didn't explain these. You didn't claim credit. You gave thanks and stepped aside. Because miracles belong to God, not you. At the same time, failure was common. You lost patients daily. And while some might curse you, others thanked you simply for trying. Their belief in something beyond medicine softened the sting of death. You weren't expected to win every battle, just to fight it faithfully. Of course, not all religion was gentle. Some patients believed they were possessed, that demons lived inside their heads, or their stomachs, or their limbs. They came to you trembling, eyes wide, voices trembling. You had herbs for calming, you had tonics for sleep. But often they ended up at the church chained, shouted over, purged with holy water. You stayed silent. It wasn't your realm. It wasn't your battle. Sometimes people blamed witches. A sudden illness. A dying child. A spoiled crop. They pointed to a neighbor, an old woman with a cat and a crooked smile. You were asked to confirm. The suspicion? To say whether the sickness was natural or cursed. You tried to speak carefully. You knew that your words could lead to fire and rope. Healing in these moments became terrifying, and yet, through it all, you kept going. You mixed your medicines with one hand and crossed yourself with the other. You believed in the saints, but you also believed in nettle and wormwood and vinegar. You wore your physician's robes, but also whispered prayers beneath your breath. You never saw your work as separate from faith. It was faith in another form. You didn't heal instead of God, you healed through Him, or so you hoped. And when you finally closed your clinic for the day, when the candles burned low and the night grew quiet, you washed your hands, folded your stained apron, and knelt for a short prayer. Not for success, perhaps, but for forgiveness, for wisdom, for the strength to face another day of wounds and weeping, because being a doctor in medieval times meant never knowing where medicine ended and the soul began. It meant holding a body in pain while the spirit searched for a meaning. And in that space between blade and belief, you found your calling. If you were a medieval doctor, you might have imagined yourself the pinnacle of medical wisdom, a man robed in knowledge, trained in the texts of Galen and Avicenna, speaking Latin, quoting the stars, and carrying the burden of health across your town. But the truth was, you were not alone, not even close. Medicine in your world was a chaotic market, a jostling crowd of voices and methods, some ancient, some improvised, all overlapping and competing. Every town, every village, every street corner had its own type of healer, And many of them, despite having no formal education, were trusted far more than you. Perhaps your most frequent competitor wasn't a man at all. It was the midwife. A woman who had seen more births than you ever would, whose fingers had caught hundreds of babies, and whose voice had soothed mothers in the dark hours of labor long before you were even trained to talk about the womb. She wasn't licensed. She couldn't read Latin, but the village knew her name. And when blood began to pool or the cries grew weak, it was her they called, not you. She used oils, warm cloths, whispered prayers, and a quiet confidence born of experience. You respected her oak often quietly, because in your heart you knew when it came to childbirth she was the expert, but your rivalry wasn't always respectful. The church often looked askance at midwives, fearing they used spells or charms, especially when they operated outside male authority. You might have been asked to oversee a delivery even if you knew less about it than the woman you were supervising. Sometimes you were the one whispering about possible witchcraft. Competition, bred suspicion, and envy. Then there were the barber surgeons, the loud, practical, often bloody-minded men who worked with razors by day and bones by night. They cut hair, drained abscesses, pulled teeth, set fractures, stitched wounds, and, if needed, amputated. Limbs with a speed you never dared attempt. They were often covered in blood, proud of it even, and considered themselves craftsmen rather than philosophers. They learned through doing. You learned through books, and yet people trusted them, especially when something needed fixing now. Barber surgeons were the ones called to battlefield camps, to the aftermath of riots, to stabbings and crushed limbs and soldiers moaning in barns. You might arrive later to check their work and offer a potion, but the first cut was often theirs. You looked down on them, officially. But deep inside, you knew. There were days when their hands saved more lives than your theories dot in towns. You also competed with apothecaries, the herbalists who stocked powders, dried plants, animal parts, oils, tinctures, and jars of things no one could quite identify. These men and sometimes women weren't necessarily healers themselves, but they understood ingredients. Some had learned through family lines, some through guild apprenticeships, others simply by experimenting. You might prescribe a mixture of comfrey and rosewater, and they'd smile knowingly, already having sold it 20 times that week for boils, headaches, or something worse thought sometimes you needed the apothecary. You didn't grow your own mandrake, or know which moss to pick after frost, but their power irritated you. They could give medicine without diagnosing, without humoral theory, without Latin, and often patients went to them first. You hear of it only after the cure failed, or worse after it worked. And then there were the wise women and folk healers, unlettered, untrained, and deeply loved. They treated the poor, the forgotten, the superstitious, and the desperate. They used charms, old songs, salves made from kitchen herbs, and rituals half remembered from their grandmothers. Some are midwives, some bone setters, some simply known as the one who helps. They were part of the landscape like wells or crossroads. You couldn't erase them. You couldn't even match their prices. They didn't wear robes. They didn't speak of bile or phlegm. But they offered something you often couldn't: comfort without cost, and familiarity. You might bring fear with your blades and foreign words. They brought soup and stories. You knew they were often guessing. But then again, so were you. The most maddening competitor, though, was the charlatan. He had no training, no apprenticeship, no sense of hygiene. But he did have confidence. He traveled from town to town with a cart full of miracle cures, colored water, ground bones, tinctures of foreign spices. He wore flashy clothes, spoke in booming tones, and dazzled crowds in marketplaces. He claimed to cure gout with a whisper, blindness with a blink. He told stories of Egyptian priests and Persian secrets. His potion sparkled. His pamphlets promised. You hated him. Not because he was dangerous, though he was, but because people believed him. Because he was cheaper than you, faster than you, and far more entertaining. He didn't explain humors or astrology. He gave people hope. Shiny, useless hope. And sometimes That was all they really wanted, but not all competition was external. You also competed with yourself, with your reputation, with the expectations laid upon you by your robe and your books. One failed cure could stain your name. For years, one nobleman's death could cause people to whisper in markets and avoid your door. You had to defend your place constantly by looking learned, sounding confident and staying aligned with the church and the nobility, even as you quietly knew that much of what you did wasn't working out in big cities. The pressure intensified. Doctors formed guilds in colleges, trying to regulate the practice. They demanded licenses. They petitioned kings. They tried to outlaw midwives, restrict barber surgeons, ban folk healers. But in villages, none of that mattered. The people went to who they trusted. Sometimes that was you. Sometimes it wasn't. You might have tried to cooperate. Shared cases with barbers, asked apothecaries for advice, treated patients together with midwives. But more often than not, lines were drawn. Authority was hoarded. The result was a patchwork of medicine, part formal, part informal, part instinct, and the patient. They simply moved between you all, gathering whatever hope they could carry Dot in the end. You learned to survive the competition not by erasing it, but by working alongside it. You stopped scoffing at midwives. You bought your herbs from the same apothecary who sold to the wise woman. You fixed what the barber broke. You treated the man poisoned by the charlatan's potion, quietly, without fanfare. Because your work was not about winning. It was about enduring. You stayed because someone had to. Because for all the guesses and failures, for all the rivals and pretenders, there were people in pain. People who looked at you and saw a flicker of, and that was enough. You competed not with others, but with ignorance, with time, with death itself. And no matter how crowded the field, you kept your blade sharp, your books closed, and your voice steady. Because in the end, you were a doctor, one of many, but still a doctor when someone in the Middle Ages said the word cure. They didn't mean a clean recovery, a tidy pill, or a quick return to normal life. The concept of a cure was something slower, messier, and entirely uncertain. To be cured in your time didn't mean you were well. It meant you had survived. You endured the pain, the procedures, the bleeding, the prayers, and whatever your doctor threw at you. If you woke up the next day still breathing, it was working. Maybe Dot to cure a patient in your world was less about science and more about ritual. You applied treatments rooted in centuries-old texts, some copied so many times that the ink had blurred and the meaning had shifted. You trusted Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna not because you had tested their ideas, but because everyone else had already agreed they were right. And so you followed their instructions even when your gut told you otherwise. Most cures started with balance. The four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, had to be brought into proper proportion. The body wasn't sick because of bacteria or viruses. It was sick because it was out of tune, like a poorly tuned harp. And your job as a doctor was to retune it. One of your most common tools for restoring balance was bloodletting. It was elegant in theory, brutal in practice. You examined the patient, looked at their tongue, felt their pulse, asked them about their dreams, and then decided which vein to open. Maybe the forearm, maybe the neck. You tied a cloth tight, picked up your lancet, and cut. Blood flowed into a bowl while the patient turned pale and lightheaded. You didn't stop because they were dizzy. You stopped when you thought the humors were balanced again. Or when they fainted. Sometimes you applied leeches instead of cutting. You placed them carefully on soft flesh, inside the arm, the thigh, behind the ear. The leeches latched on, wriggling and swelling as they fed. Patients hated it. Some cried. Others stayed still, trusting that the little creatures knew what they were doing. You watched the blood drain, said something reassuring, and waited. If bleeding didn't seem appropriate, you turned to purging. You gave your patient herbs to make them vomit hellebore sometimes, or even powdered metals if you could dip them. Or you prepared a laxative from rhubarb root, goose fat, or old wine. The goal was to expel the bad humors from the other end. Patients writhed on the floor or collapsed beside chamber pots. You wiped their foreheads, murmured encouragement, and waited for the purging to finish. If they stopped retching, you considered that a success. Sometimes you used cupping. You heated glass or metal cups, then placed them on the skin. As they cooled, they created suction, pulling blood and heat to the surface. The flesh turned purple. Blisters formed. The patient groaned. You nodded sagely, as if something unseen had been corrected. And if nothing else worked, you turned to cauterization, fire, heat, burning. You took an iron rod from the hearth, glowing red, and pressed it to the skin, usually over a wound or sore. The smell was sickening. The patient screamed or passed out, but it sealed the flesh. It kept poison inside or out. It was harsh, it was final, and sometimes it even helped. You also relied on herbs and concoctions, though these too were a gamble. Some were gently helpful, peppermint for digestion, lavender for calm. Others were dangerous. Mandrake could numb pain, but in the wrong dose, it could stop the heart. Henbane dulled the senses but blurred the mind. You made poultices with garlic, vinegar, honey, pig's fat, crushed bones, moss, and wine. You wrapped them in linen and pressed them to boils, burns, or swollen joints. You watched, you waited. Sometimes the wound improved. Sometimes it grew black and spread. For fevers, you gave cold compresses, often rags soaked in vinegar or rose water. You opened windows, you sprinkled herbs around the bed. You might even tie an onion to the patient's wrist or place a toad under the bed. Not because you knew it worked, but because it might. And your patient expected you to try. A cure might also involve prayer. You murmured Latin under your breath, lit a candle, touched a saint's relic to the skin. This wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the treatment. You had been taught that illness had spiritual origins. And even if you didn't always believe, your patients did. They wanted their souls cleansed along with their bowels. They wanted their sickness named, then forgiven. You might also administer powdered gemstones, ground sapphire, or coral if the patient could afford it. These were believed to hold mystical properties. They sparkled in the light. They were hard to get, and they gave the illusion of power, of exotic knowledge. The rich loved them. You gave them sparingly, letting the patient believe they were special. Surgery was rare and terrifying. You only resorted to it when there was no other choice. Abscesses had to be drained. Tumors had to be removed. Broken limbs had to be reset. Amputations were a last resort, done quickly with a blade, then sealed with hot metal. No anesthesia. Just speed, prayer, and screaming. If the patient survived, you were hailed as a miracle worker. If they didn't, well, the infection was already too far gone. Recovery was always uncertain. Even a cured patient might relapse. Wounds reopened. Fevers returned. Coughs lingered. You did your best to explain it. Bad air, weak blood, imbalance. But deep down, you knew you didn't really know. And neither did anyone else. The truth was, a cure often meant the patient hadn't died yet. Maybe the boil stopped growing. Maybe the bleeding stopped. Maybe the fever broke after a week. And if the patient got up and walked again slowly, carefully, they said you cured them. You said nothing. You just nodded that. You had no charts, no tests. You judged success by color of the skin, steadiness of the breath, and how many times they vomited. You examined urine in glass flasks, yellow, clear, brown, cloudy. You smelled it. You swirled it. You held it up to the light. That was your lab dot and the failures. You buried them. Not literally others did that, but inside yourself. You blamed the timing, the stars, the humors, the patient's own constitution. You didn't always cry, but sometimes you did. Quietly after they left your home, especially if they were young. Still, you kept going. Because people believed in you. Because sometimes someone did get better. And because not trying was worst dot in your world, a cure was not clean. It was not exact. It was a desperate mix of hope, tradition, pain, and faith. You bled, burned, and purged your way toward the unknown, armed with nothing more than old books and older instincts. And every time someone thanked you, every time a child ran again, or a mother smiled weakly from her bed, you remembered why. You did it, even when it didn't work, even when it was gross, even when it was guesswork. You cured because they believed you could, and sometimes that belief was the only medicine you had.